Hi, everybody. Welcome to Writing Better AutoPkg Recipes with Recipe Robot. First, we want to say thank you to PSU and to everybody who's organizing this great event. It's really an honor to be participating, and it's an honor to have all you show up here, so thank you. I am Elliot Jordan, and my friend here is Shea Craig. I'm from the Lindy Group in Emeryville, California. We do IT consulting around the Bay Area for lots of businesses, solving IT problems all over the place. And we're hiring, so if anybody wants to move out to the Bay Area, it's a great place to live, seriously. I'll let Shea talk about what he does.
Yeah, hi, so Shea Craig. I work at a company called SAS. We're the world leader in analytics, and we're in North Carolina. I used to be at a school, so it's a big change for me, and super excited to be here, represent them.
And the third Beatle, who's not present today, is Eldon Arold. He helped us write Recipe Robot. He's in St. Louis, Missouri. He's a crucial part of the team, and we're appreciative to him as well. We want to talk a little bit today about what Recipe Robot is, how it works, some ways that you can save time when you're using Recipe Robot, and then we'll get into some really good stuff. We're going to help use Recipe Robot to audit existing AutoPkg recipes. We're going to augment existing recipes with URL text searcher so that we can parse a download page for a download link. And we're even going to create child recipes using Recipe Robot that use existing recipes as parents, which is something that Recipe Robot doesn't do by default, but there's a little workaround that I'll show you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about publishing your recipes, troubleshooting, and answer some questions. So there's a lot to cover. We're going to go pretty fast and try to keep everybody awake because it's right after lunch. I know that was a really good mint cake. So I'm going to dive right in. First, what is Recipe Robot? It is an app, a tool, that is for the Mac admin community. It helps solve a particular problem. Much like it's kind of, I don't know, what would you say? It's peers, yeah. Like it tries to follow in the footsteps of apps like AutoPkg and Monkey Admin that try to make something a little bit smoother and easier in the whole ecosystem of deploying software to Macs. And the part that we wanted to make easier is the creation of AutoPkg recipes. Easy, automatic, and fast creation of those recipes. We also wanted to bring people into the Mac AutoPkg ecosystem who maybe weren't familiar or comfortable with the concepts and just didn't want to have to write their own recipes and but still wanted to be involved. So this just kind of breaks down one more barrier for people and invites them into the community, which is great. We also obviously wanted to give something back to the community from which we've benefited so much. There are so many great Mac apps out there for Mac admins, and a lot of them are free, a lot of them are open source. Recipe Robot is both because we just wanted to give back a little bit. So if you see one of your icons up there, thank you. You have our undying gratitude. And if I missed any icons that somebody's written a tool and I didn't include it here, thank you as well. It's a great community. So Recipe Robot comes in two forms. There's a Mac app and a Python script. And I'm going to show you today all the examples using the Python script because I think it's a little bit easier to troubleshoot and see what's going on. But the Mac app is just a UI for the Python script. It's going to do the same thing regardless of which way you go. It's all available on GitHub at that URL there. I don't recommend downloading it all at once on Wi-Fi, but you can go there and check it out if you want. And now I'd like to show you real quick Recipe Robot in action. I'm going to take Recipe Robot and create a set of AutoPkg recipes for the app Coconut Battery, which is kind of a battery stats monitor for laptops. And I'm just going to breeze through this real quick. First, we type Recipe Robot -- verbose, drag in the path to the app. It's going to do some things and collect some facts about that app. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then, boom, we've got 4 recipes ready to go. There's a monkey recipe, install recipe, download, and a package recipe already written. And obviously, they're no good if they don't work. So let's take that monkey recipe, and we're going to actually run that through AutoPkg without modification. Obviously, in production, you would want to test and tweak those recipes before you put them into production. So it's running the monkey recipe now, URL, downloading the URL, creating a DMG, and then eventually importing it into Monkey. This is not sped up. This is happening in real time. It's pretty quick. There you go. Recipe Robot recipe produced a coconut battery 333 in our monkey repo, which is, at the time, it was the latest version. So it's great. So how did that all work? It's not magic, right? It's all just computer talk. We tell it what to do in Python, and it magically does the thing. But no, it's not magic. And I'm going to let Shea talk a little bit about that, because among the two of us, he's the Python expert. So take it away.
Jeez, that's a lot of pressure.
That's a lot of pressure, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go unscripted for just a second and point out that, I don't know, it zipped by pretty fast, but you may have noticed that Recipe Robot at the end reports that you've created 3,131 recipes on there. So in the process of making this thing, I think Elliot has single-handedly eclipsed the entire rest of the AutoPkg community in recipe output. And so we have this tool that makes it really simple to automate the creation of every possible variant of AutoPkg recipe and its dependencies. And it's almost automated himself out of the job. I mean, yeah, there's still plenty of things that may need to be automated, but
we were worried by the time we were done testing Recipe Robot that there would be no more recipes needed to create. But
exhausted the world's supply.
Yeah.
That's right. Fortunately, we still have a few more years. We're not at peak recipe yet.
Okay,
So, but I think it is an interesting thing to point out too, that this thing came out of an article that Alistair Banks wrote, where he flowcharted this idea that you start to realize as you do more of these by hand that they follow really regular processes. And if you can see those repeating patterns, you can make it automated in a way that you don't have to do so much editing. And you know, we did this as part of was it a month-long challenge? Was it a little longer than that?
Yeah, I think we had a little bit more time, but yeah, it was part of the MacBrain Hackathon this last year in 2015. So we had a deadline that we set for ourselves.
Who won that?
Recipe Robot did.
Oh, amazing.
You betcha.
So the code in this thing it's an interesting experiment for all of us, because this is, for me, definitely the first project where I've started pretty much from the very beginning. And worked with just a small team to try and collaborate on doing this. And so there's a lot of architectural decisions and things in there that you don't have to worry about, but it's still being improved behind the scenes. But the idea of it was that you could feed it any one of the number of type of inputs, and it's going to use that input to try and determine, how do I make a package out of this, this product? And the kinds of things that it accepts are, trying to remember the whole list now. So it's a Sparkle feed URL, a download URL, any one a number of types of downloads themselves, and just a raw, dirty app.
And GitHub, SourceForge, and Bitbucket.
Yeah. So, and the way it tries to determine how to download the app that you're trying to make a recipe for is that it goes through exhaustively and recursively through all the different things that it can learn about whatever object it was that you dumped into Recipe Robot. And I think it's particularly apt that in the video screencast that we showed earlier, Elliot just dragged that coconut battery in and dropped it in. I mean, that's at a certain level, that's how we wanted to make it work, is super automatic. So we have this super confusing flowchart here, and I expect everyone later in the question and answer period, we'll have a graded test about how this works and what the flowchart is. But again, that's part of the reason why we did this, is because we didn't want to have to remember to do this in the right order personally when we're text editing like savages in our terminal to make these recipes. So in general, the way it works is if you drop an app in, it takes a look at that app. And the app inside has a info.plist file. It has all sorts of important information about that app. It has to be in there for it to execute. And it looks to see, does this app have a Sparkle feed URL? And Sparkle is a framework that a lot of apps use. I'm sure everyone's experienced it, where you're just happily doing your computing tasks, and then it interrupts you and lets you know that there's an update that you need to install. And it can download it, quit the app, install the update, and then start the app again. And that turns out to be a really good source of how do I download updates? Because the vendor is pushing those out. It's got a whole list of what's current. So if it finds that, it's pretty much happy. It's done. That one wins against everything else. But it's certainly capable of using other sources as well. So if you just, at the other end of the scale, go to a web page, it's got a download link on it, you can cut and paste that as your input to Recipe Robot. It's going to go to that page and download that thing. And it's going to look at the thing that was downloaded and say, hey, is this a zip file, or is this a disk image? Is it a package? And it knows how to unarchive those things or blow those packages up into a broken up package and then find the information that it needs to find. So if it's a zip file, it unarchives it. Oh, great, there's an app inside. Now I can look in the info plist and see if there's a Sparkle feed. If there's not a Sparkle feed, then maybe I need to look somewhere else. So once we know what the download URL is, that's like half the battle, G.I. Joe style. We know how to get the update. Now becomes the kind of procedural, let's turn it into something that we can get into our management system of choice, be it Monkey, Casper. I guess people use Casper. I've heard of that before. The next thing it needs to do, though, is because these management systems, it's not necessarily about just getting a package into the management system. There's a lot of other information about the product that you need to have. And there's also a lot of information about that product that you're going to need to make even make the package itself. And you can see we have another one of these really elaborate flowcharts here. And you get an idea of the kinds of things it looks for, and it just goes down the list. What can I find out about this? What can I find out about this? What's the name? What's the Sparkle feed? What's the bundle identifier? Not every child recipe is going to need all of this information, but many of them need a subset of that. So we just exhaustively figure out everything we can from that. And I think in a lot of ways, this is, we're going to talk about this later, but this is one of the ways that makes it really easy to learn how to write AutoPkg recipes or improve your AutoPkg recipe writing, is that you can save yourself the legwork of trying to figure out all this information. I'm going to crack open contextual click on a package and then look in the contents of it and drill your way down, or an app and look at the plist file, and now I got to look through all the noise of the keys of that plist.
And the goal is to get as much information as we need to generate recipes. And if we don't have enough information, we have an out. We error out and say, sorry, we don't have what we need. But if we do have what we need, then we go to the process of generating recipes. And it's the same process we would follow if we were doing it manually.
Yeah. And I think probably the one thing to point out that we didn't cover here is that it automatically handles the code signing issues. And I think that above and beyond, probably that's the most confusing part of the recipe writing process is, oh, what's that?
Boom.
Oh.
So if the app is signed, it does gather the code signing information so that we can use that again later.
Yeah, it really streamlines that process and makes it a lot easier. So once it's got all that information, it builds some recipes. And this little chart is just demonstrating the download recipe. And you want me to animate it?
Yeah, of course. Why not?
So it goes through and it makes a lot of decisions. And again, this really originated with this flowchart that Alistair came up with. There are patterns to this process. If you know that you want to have at the end of the download process a downloaded app that you know what the version is and that it has not failed the code signature verification, then you need to go through this path. It takes care of worrying about all that for you, and we'll spend some time later examining how those processors fit together. And this is, this chart is for the download recipe, but it follows the same procedure for each one of the potential child recipes that you can make from it.
So the recipes that it creates obviously are not infallible. Sometimes there are two different apps in the DMG and it grabs the wrong one. There's an install and uninstall package, and it infers the wrong thing. So it's still, as you as the administrator, if you create these recipes, are still responsible for checking them, making sure they do what you want. It's not going to read your mind necessarily. But using that flowchart, it's pretty accurate for basic Mac apps.
Yeah, and at the very least, in that situation, if you crack open a disk image and there's 2 apps in it, Recipe Robot may blow up, but now you can drag one of those apps into Recipe Robot and run it again. So it's just going to automate a lot of information gathering at the very least, and it really sets a precedent for here are the kinds of things that you're going to have to do to turn this into an object in your management system. Yeah. One of the other things that we need to stress right away, though, is that it only builds complete recipe sets. Right? And what I mean by this is, say you want to make a JSS recipe. You use Casper, and you want to make a recipe because somebody has already made a recipe for that product, but they haven't made a Casper recipe, which is a pretty reasonable thing. If you use Monkey at your organization, you're probably not going to make a Casper recipe, especially because you're responsible for that. You have no way of testing it and verifying that it actually works. So why shovel a broken thing out on the internet for other people to complain about? There's enough complaining on the internet already. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's a kind of negative place sometimes. So it doesn't build, it only builds complete recipe sets. It has to make the download recipe. It has to make a package recipe for a lot of the child recipes like the JSS importer needs a package. Monkey can take just a bare app or a disk image, and that's one of the advantages of Monkey, but in terms of Recipe Robot, we want to be able to support all those things. So it's happy to make the complete chain of recipes so that you know that they'll all work. But we're going to talk about this later. There are ways to work around this, and we'll get to it. You just have to be patient.
Big reveal.
Yeah. And finally, Recipe Robot just won't work with some apps. So anything that has no Sparkle feed, doesn't have a publicly accessible download link, or a few other situations, it's going to have problems. But again, it's going to really make it a lot easier to gather as much information as you can get out of those objects and go from there. It's not always a lost cause, but it allows you to spend your time focusing on those special problem packages that you need to create recipes for rather than just doing a lot of busy work.
So before we jump in to the how-to part, I guess I want to talk about a couple time-saving tips, most of which I'm sure you already know. But there's one in particular that I love, which is to edit your bash profile to include an alias to the actual binary for Recipe Robot. And that way, instead of typing the entire /application /recipierobot.app, et cetera, you can actually just type Recipe Robot. Or you could do it whatever you want. You can type RR, and it'll go to that binary like a shortcut. So that's the process for doing that. All these slides are going to be available, so you don't have to scribble that down.
We could probably put a to-do item to put in like someplace in the path a
thought about that.
To that
yeah,
too.
yeah.
Somebody write that down and remind us later.
Yeah, open a GitHub issue. Next, obviously, use a good text editor when you're editing recipes, when you're viewing recipes. A good text editor, quote unquote, is a very subjective thing. I would say not Word, not Pages, not TextEdit generally. Text Wrangler, Atom, TextMate, BBEdit, Sublime Text, and there are many, many more. I prefer Atom for most things, but I use Text Wrangler for opening binaryplists, and I use Sublime Text for Markdown. So it's they all do really good job.
You'll notice the conspicuous absence of the best text editor, which is Vim.
Just so we're clear.
Just so we're clear, yeah.
Yes. And what a good text editor gives you is syntax highlighting, so you can really parse easily through the recipes and see what pieces are important. Labeled a couple of the pieces here that are important keys and values and such. And it makes, when you make a mistake in a recipe, it makes it really obvious, depending on the editor. It can really get in your face and say, nope, that's not right. Some text editors even have built-in linting and can give you the details about what you're doing wrong, if you're doing something wrong. And then you can even have things like autofill, just like autofilling a form on the web. You can have it type ahead, type str tab, and it'll fill out a whole string tag, and you just start typing the string, like what you're seeing here. So I love that. I use it all the time. It just helps me eliminate errors and increase my speed. And I would also suggest mastering Markdown. If you're involved in GitHub or open source projects, Markdown is kind of the de facto language nowadays for READMEs and for documentation of some sort. and more and more, I think, for wikis and things like that. So it's just a good language to get to know how to do. It's not even really a language, it's just markup. It's a couple extra characters around words here and there. It's pretty easy to learn.
I think this is an opportunity to insert the plug for our other presentation too, where we're going to be spending an awful lot of time talking about documentation. It is about Monkey, but we're also spending a lot of time just on institutional Mac management best practices, and Markdown plays a huge role in that presentation.
Absolutely.
So
onward to the good stuff. Learning to read and write AutoPkg recipes. So the veterans in here, hang on, we're going to get to the really advanced stuff. But Recipe Robot is good not just for veterans, it's also good for people that are new to AutoPkg. And not just to do the work for you, it's also to help you learn how to do the work, learn how to write recipes by giving you an example to follow. And the way that happens is recipes follow patterns. All AutoPkg recipes are based on patterns, and that's, as with many things in the computer, it's all just ones and zeros at the end. So we as humans are really good at recognizing recurring patterns. We're kind of programmed that way, evolutionarily. So there are a couple patterns in AutoPkg recipes that really come to light as the more recipes you read. One of them is kind of what I call the separation of responsibility. What did you call it? The single
responsibility principle?
Yeah. So it's a computer science thing, and because I didn't pay attention during that class, I called it something else, but same idea. Each recipe has a distinct goal, and all the processors within that recipe are kind of aligned to accomplish that goal. For example, the download recipe, the job is to download the software. The package recipe creates a PKG installer file for that software. The JSS recipe imports that package into your JSS, so they kind of build on each other. And Recipe Robot fits in by respecting that kind of flow and that separation of responsibility, and even calling it out to you. Like in the description of AutoPkg recipes, Recipe Robot tells you what that recipe does. And so you can really start to pick up on that pattern, like every time I produce a Monkey recipe, it's telling me it's going to import into the Monkey repo. Pretty obvious, but it's just one of those patterns. The other pattern that emerges is the parent-child relationship. And this is, this wasn't in the first version of AutoPkg, actually. I was a relative latecomer to AutoPkg, so I got to slide in after everything was nice and feature-rich. But there was a day when there was no such thing as a child recipe. I hear the old-timers tell me.
Yeah,
and
you kids have it so good these days.
Yeah, kids have it so good. So we get to benefit from that by building recipes that can build off of each other. So for example, the download recipe would be the parent recipe, and then the package recipe and the JSS recipe would both be child recipes of that of the parent, and they would just continue to build and build and build and continue to process the output from the previous recipes, processors. And then finally, there's a thing called the recipe override, which is basically exactly a child recipe. There's no difference in the way AutoPkg treats recipe overrides versus child recipes. And the difference between them is kind of human convention. It's what we as recipe authors have tended to do, which is to override input variables on overrides. But recipe overrides tend not to have processors. They don't have any process key. And that's how you tell the difference between a recipe override and a child recipe. But to AutoPkg, it's the same thing. So that's another pattern. And Recipe Robot respects this by telling you right there, this is the parent recipe that this new recipe that I built was built on. So it's raining, isn't it?
Do we need to, is there any kind of government warning on anyone's phones that we need to worry about?
Yeah, we'll be fine. So, yeah, they're clapping for us. So how do we know that recipes are doing the thing that they say they're doing in the description? Well, that's where processors come in. In order to know what the recipe is actually doing, you read the processors in order, and you can kind of figure it out most of the time. So here, I went too far, didn't I?
You did.
There we go. So here you can see I highlighted the 4 processors that this recipe is using. The Sparkle Update info provider goes to the Sparkle feed and gets the latest URL to download the latest app. URL downloader actually downloads that file and puts it in the cache. End of check phase is a processor that really doesn't do anything. It's just used as a flag to tell AutoPkg to stop if it's running what's called check mode. If you do AutoPkg -- check, it only runs up to the end of check phase and then stops. Normally when you're doing a run, it just blows right through that. Code signature verifier is really important. It makes sure that the app or package or whatever that you downloaded is what you think it is. It compares it to a known good value, and if that app doesn't, if the app code signing doesn't match that value, it stops and throws an error. So it kind of protects you from downloading something you're not expecting. So there are some common processor groupings that occur. This is another pattern that you'll see in AutoPkg recipes. URL downloader is typically always followed by the end of check phase. And most download recipes that have a direct download URL, that's it. If it's not a signed app, if it's a simple unsigned app, you'll simply just see URL downloader and end of check phase. Here's an example of an unsigned app with a Sparkle feed. And notice it's got the same URL downloader and end of check phase, but feeding into URL downloader is Sparkle update info provider, which gives the URL to the URL downloader. And similarly, if you have a signed app inside of a zip with a direct download URL, it starts to look like this. And you'll see that for all the apps that are packaged in zip form and are signed with a direct download, you'll typically see these 5 processors in the download recipe over and over again. And so we took advantage of that, and Recipe Robot knows how to use those patterns. Here's, for example, an unsigned app in the DMG that can be directly imported into Monkey. Monkey is smart enough to look inside the DMG and take that app, understand that you want to put that in the applications folder, and it imports it. And here's another one for a signed DMG that goes into your JSS. So the DMG has to be converted into package format in order for Casper to know what to do with it. So the versioner, package root creator, and copier, and package creator processors are all necessary to create that PKG file that the JSS is going to use. And same thing here for a signed zip going to the JSS. Now, the dotted lines around all these recipes are actually meaningful. The processor order, actually, it doesn't matter what recipe the processor lives in. The versioner processor could live in the package recipe, as you see there, or it could live in the download recipe. As long as it's executed in the same order, you're going to get the same result. You could make one big recipe that's called foo.doeseverything.recipe, and it'll do all the processors, and you'll get the same result. It'll just be a little bit harder to override all those things if you want to create child recipes. So what I like to do sometimes is to take the versioner processor and bump that up in the order. Basically put that in the download recipe, because otherwise, if authors want to create children recipes from my download recipe and need a version available to them, they would have to add their own versioner processor anyway. So why not just make that information available? We've already unarchived the zip file, so there's no extra processing necessary to make that happen. So let's move it to the download, like so. And then we have that information available if child recipes need it. And so Recipe Robot does this. This is the default. If it needs a versioning processor, it puts it right in the download recipe so that other apps can use it. So let's walk through the flowchart one more time with TM Notifier, for example, as an example here. So TM Notifier is a signed app. It's a direct download. So we add the URL provider, the URL downloader, and the end of check phase. And the URL provider is, I think it's actually a Sparkle app. So it's the Sparkle update info provider that we would add there. And then we decide, is it signed? We add the code signature requirements here. And then we skip all the rest because it's not applicable. Recipe Robot already makes that determination. So we get to the end and we go on and make the other recipe types too. So part of the practice of kind of recognizing these patterns that Recipe Robot makes obvious is to perform a diff on 2 recipes that Recipe Robot has created. Or maybe perform a diff on a recipe that somebody else created and compare it to what Recipe Robot created. And you'll start to see these patterns emerge. So for example, these are 2 different download recipes. One of them is a direct download, and the other one is a Sparkle feed that produces the download. And you can see on the right, it's got an extra processor, Sparkle update info provider, that has that Sparkle feed. and it doesn't have a download URL in the input variables. It's just the Sparkle feed. Other than that, the recipes are pretty much the same. So you can start to match those patterns and use them in your mind. Here are two others. 2 different package recipes for 2 different apps, but they're exactly the same except for the name and the bundle ID of the apps. That's how similar these two things, these recipes. So you start to get in your mind these templates of certain types of apps can fit certain types of recipe groupings. So one of the things you can do with that knowledge is to run through the recipes that you've already built using Recipe Robot and compare them to what you wrote a long time ago before Recipe Robot existed and improve upon them. So I'm going to let Shea talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the other possible use case for this to point out is that not only can you use this on your own recipes to see what kinds of best practices may have emerged or are coded into Recipe Robot that aren't in your old recipes, but you could also use it to audit all of the recipes that you are committed to providing to your organization. So, the Firefox recipe has been there for a really long time. Maybe as part of your audit of your entire management stack, you want to go through and make sure that it's following all the best practices that you've learned are applicable to AutoPkg, code signing, and all that other stuff. So
yeah, and if you're in a company that really cares about that and doesn't want to rely on external code, you can use Recipe Robot to produce a brand new, fresh, Firefox recipe, for example, and compare it to what's already written. It'll probably be very similar, but it's code that your company would potentially sign off on because it's made from scratch.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point to bring up because I think the AutoPkg organization that hosts all these repos is it's open for us all to contribute to, and that means that we're also at the whim of whomever puts stuff out there. I think it always bears repeating that it's trivial to make a recipe that will completely hose a computer if somebody felt like they needed to be malicious or maybe they're just doing a bad job of it. There's no barrier to entry to this organization, and as a professional you have a certain responsibility to your organization to make sure that what you're putting on people's computers is what you think it is.
But not to scare anybody away, though.
Yeah, well, we've had 2 days of you on, so we're like super tense about security all of a sudden. So the first step that we would probably take to audit our existing AutoPkg recipes is that we need to standardize them in some way so that we can use these pretty simple diff tools. And the easiest way to do that is use this command line utility called plutil. It's plist utility because all of the recipes are plists, and it just does some basic things to that plist. It's going to find any syntax errors and complain about them, so you can fix those before it gets any further. It's going to convert all the leading spaces to tabs, and that way you're not going to see a lot of noise in your diff tool about, oh, well, this one's got 4 space characters and this one's got a tab, or 8 space characters and this one's got a tab. It goes through and it takes any item in the plist that has a dictionary value, and it alphabetizes the keys so that when you compare things, they're in the same order. An array of things, order is important, but a dictionary, the order of the keys is irrelevant for the actual use of the dictionary for programming, but for visual diffing, it helps to have that stuff sorted. So it'll take care of that. And then it also strips out XML comments. So you can put XML comments, which are angle bracket, exclamation point, dash dash something in there, but it's not really valid plist character. So that gets stripped out. It does leave any arbitrary key that you put in there. So I think one of the things that people don't realize right away is that when you're making an AutoPkg recipe, you can put in whatever key you want, and if that's not an actual input variable, or if that doesn't exist in the language that AutoPkg accepts, nothing bad happens. In fact, you can actually use that to your advantage sometimes to create input variables or put variables into the environment that the processors don't allow you to do. So to leave those alone, and we'll move on to the next stage here. So the next thing you would have to do is find the input that created the recipe that you're trying to audit. So you're probably going to open up the download recipe for the product and find the download URL or Sparkle feed URL, and you're going to run that through Recipe Robot. Let Recipe Robot build a complete recipe set for you to diff against the existing recipe. You'll notice that chances are pretty good that if you're interested in auditing an existing recipe exists out in the world. It's probably in the AutoPkg organization repo, recipe repos. So we have to use this ignore existing flag to tell Recipe Robot, you know what, it's okay. I know that that recipe already exists. Go ahead and build a recipe set anyway. And just ignore the ones that are out there. You're going to throw this into your diff tool. Elliot has this wonderful kaleidoscope app, which does beautiful diffing. I like to use the command line for everything and never touch a mouse if I can avoid it. So I do it. I often will do it with the 2-column diff. But it's up to you. Whatever tool you like to use, it's totally fine. And what we're going to do is put the original recipe on one side and put the Recipe Robot recipe on the right side. And then it's up to you to look at the differences and apply the changes that you like and just ignore the ones that you don't like. So there are some design decisions that we made in trying to come up with a best practice for AutoPkg recipes that you may not agree with or you don't want to have in there. For example, you may not want to have a comment that says created with Recipe Robot in your recipe that you didn't actually create with Recipe Robot. Nobody's going to stab you in the night if you don't have that comment in there. Maybe. So some of the things that this particular example caught in diffing the two things is, yeah, it's got a description, but you'll notice that it also corrects the spelling in the description field. So the old one says downloads the latest variant of Tower. That was a typo, or maybe somebody accidentally cut that out when they were text editing and saved it and committed it, and now it's in there.
My bad.
Yeah. So it gets fixed because Recipe Robot creates those descriptions of what's happening. It turns the download URL into an input variable. So instead of hard coding the input variable, or hard coding the download URL into the URL downloader processor, it's moved it up into the input section. This allows anyone to then come along later and write an override recipe to select a different URL. In most cases, it's never going to be used. But if you're an international company or you have to deal with different language versions of software, or perhaps they offer a beta version alongside the regular version and you want to have both, if you have that download URL as an input variable, it allows you to use one recipe for both and just feed it different values and overrides. Again, it's not going to be used most of the time, but it also doesn't hurt to have it there. So Recipe Robot puts that in there by default in case that you might actually want to use it sometime in the future. Let's see. Oh, and it throws that end of check phase processor in there. So if that's not in there, it's not the end of the world. But again, that's a best practice that we've included. We put that at the end of all of the download sections of download recipes.
It's not the end of the world, but it is the end of the check phase.
I thought that was funny.
Yeah, thank you.
I need a second to collect myself now. You can see it also added, I think this is the major advantage here, is that it slapped a code signature verifier in there. Again, filling that thing out, learning all the different permutations of which code signing input variables you need, which processors to use to accomplish this task, it's not an insignificant thing to learn. And Recipe Robot, at the very least, can make that super easy. I know prior to Recipe Robot, Elliot had just, was it Automator drag and drop icon?
Yeah, I made a service that you could right-click on an app and get those code signing requirements. But I stopped using that once we made this because it's so much easier.
But it's not generally something you want to do just because you're bored at work. There's lots of cool stuff on YouTube to see instead of digging out code signature verification stuff. And then finally, it changes in this recipe to use a different version key.
Yeah, it turns out the original author was using CF bundle version, which Recipe Robot determined is either wrong or not necessary, so it used CF bundle short version string instead. We could go look at the verbose output from the run and see why it made that choice, but it's usually right.
So just to recap, the process for auditing existing recipes is that you're going to standardize the recipe with PL util and get all that stuff alphabetized, cleaned up, ready to diff, and you're going to find the input argument to Recipe Robot and run it so that it creates its own set of complete recipes, and then compare those new recipes with the old ones using your diff tool and apply the changes you like and discard the ones you don't. So the next thing we want to talk about is augmenting recipes with URL text searcher. We're going into the arcane world of regular expressions, which is one of my favorite places to be.
You paid for the full chair, but you only need the edge of it, right? The edge of your seat.
Yeah. Yeah, I have nothing to add.
Yep.
So this is an example of a page where we would need this. So drop DMG, this app has on the vendor's download page a link that if you look at the source and figure out what the link URL to download this is, it says, okay, here's how you download this disk image. Go to our website, subfolder downloads, and download dropdmg-3.3.dmg. Great. So you create a Recipe Robot recipe for this, and every single time you run it, you get a brand new copy of dropdmg 3.3. That's not the point. AutoPkg's mandate or job is to give you the most up-to-date version of this. So it's going to work over and over and over again for 3.3, and then when 3.4 comes out, or even an amazing new release called dropdmg 4.0, it's not going to know what to do because it's looking for 3.3. So URL text searcher comes to the rescue. Do you remember who wrote this processor?
Jesse Peterson. Yeah.
Yes. So prior to this processor, back in the dark ages, I guess, of AutoPkg, lots of people were writing their own custom processors to do regular expression searches on web pages, scrape the web page and find the download URL. And Jesse realized that, once again, here's another one of these patterns that repeat over and over and over again. Let's make it a lot easier to do. And so we have this URL text searcher processor. The input to this processor is you have to give it a page to search. And in this case, it's that ccommand.com dropdmg. If we go back to the web, back to the web page, you know, there's the download URL, but we can't feed that in. We need just this page. And if you can, it's Safari, so it's hidden the full path there. But we just want this page as input to our URL text searcher. The next thing it needs to know is what exactly it is looking for, and that, in a lot of cases, is going to require a little bit of knowledge of regular expressions, and you're going to have to figure out.
That's the mishmash right there.
Yeah. You're going to have to be able to identify, all right, looking at the source for this page, what is it that is the download link? And what is it about that download link that I expect will vary? In this case, and in almost all cases, I think, you know, Mr. Banks and I, again, last year, had a regular expression party at dinner one night, and I think that was the overriding theme from it, was that people really tend to want to create these elegant, like as short as possible, amazing regular expressions, when in reality, this download URL is probably going to be exactly the same except for the version number. That's the only thing that's going to change. And if the vendor changes the URL where they store that, like they're changing the way they host those updates or they move stuff around, no regular expression you write is probably going to catch that. So it's going to fail one way or the other.
Right. We're passing notes.
Yeah, I see it. So, getting a little wild with my finger. So what we're going to have to do is create a download recipe using that recipe robot to just download one static package, and then we're going to slap a URL text searcher processor in there. And I'm going to see if I can follow along with this video here. Is it running? Do I have to click?
One more. There it goes.
Yeah, there we go. So there's the process. So we're grabbing the download link, and we're going to paste that into Recipe Robot, and it does its thing. And thankfully, it says, hey, wait a minute, this looks like a version in the download URL. So it will warn you and say, you know what? Chances are pretty good that this is not going to work the way you think it's going to work. So we can go and open up our newly created download recipe, and if you're really cool like Elliot, you can just automatically pop a URL text searcher in with a text expander macro, and somehow he's magically created the regular expression instantaneously so that it knows what to do. But we're basically just saying the only thing that varies in this recipe are these numbers. So grab this URL, and I want to know what those numbers are, and I want to output them as a variable called version. And we're going to tack that on to our URL downloader and replace the part where it says 3.3 with a text replacement that copies in that version value. So now it's going to just find whatever is current on the page and download it. Of course, this is the very hand-wavy, quick version of how this works. There's a lot of resources out there about how to do this and how to get better.
And the real benefit of that is that Recipe Robot takes care of all the rest of it. All you have to do is the URL text searcher. You give it the download URL, and it generates all the code signature verification and the package recipe, the monkey recipe, all that stuff is taken care of. All you have to do is go back to the beginning and add that URL text searcher in. So huge time saver.
I think that in the vast majority of cases, if you can identify that one thing that changes, which is probably the version number, you're going to be able to solve that problem and move on. And once you've done it one time, it really becomes pretty fast to just be like, okay, this is a number. How many times does it repeat?
Right.
There might be a letter in there too.
And a dot. So this is my favorite section, so I'm going to kick you out and take over. You know, Recipe Robot only creates total recipe sets. It can't build recipes based on existing recipes that are out there. However, we can work around that by using ignore existing and building the whole set, which will build whatever recipes you want. Say you want a JSS recipe, for example, and there's only a download, a package, and a monkey recipe. You can have Recipe Robot build the whole set of download, package, and JSS recipe, and then we can switch the recipe that it's using as the parent recipe to the existing one. And what that does is essentially it builds from the existing one, and then Recipe Robot's generated recipes take over from that. So I know that was super fast. I'm going to give you an example. And there are some things you have to tweak and some caveats and disclaimers, but I'm going to show you. Basically, the process is you do the same thing as if you were going to audit your recipe. You take that download URL and the Sparkle feed in the existing recipe, build a totally new set, and then just take that one new recipe that you want, change the parent recipe, and test and tweak. So we're going to try this out with Cinesync. There is a package recipe for Cinesync, but there's no JSS recipe. And let's say we want one. So we're going to build one using Recipe Robot. So here's what we would do. We'd go into the existing Cinesync download recipe, and we would grab the URL that it's using to download. In this case, Cinesync is using URL text searcher like we just demonstrated. So we're going to go to the Cinesync web page and copy the download link because that's the seed that it's using from URL text searcher. We're going to put that back into Recipe Robot with ignore existing specified. And that's going to ignore that all those recipes are already there, and it's going to generate all new Cinesync recipes, including a JSS recipe, which we've already specified in our preferences. So it's downloading it now. This is sped up slightly. And now we've got all these recipes that Recipe Robot just generated. We only need the JSS recipe, plus the icon, because that's useful for JSS. So we're going to delete all the others, open the JSS recipe, and we're going to go back to the existing package recipe, which is the parent of the JSS normally. And we're going to grab the identifier of that package recipe, and we're going to paste it into the parent recipe key on the new JSS recipe. So that's Greg Nagel's package recipe, is now the parent recipe of our brand new JSS recipe. And so it's just building from one to the other. And now, if we run that through, there's definitely going to be some tweaking that's going to be necessary. And depending on the recipe and the author of the existing recipe, you may need to do a lot of tweaking, you may need to not do any. In this case, it's a big download. In this case, I'll skip to the end, but the version is not going to be quite JSS compatible. It's going to say Cinesync 3.7 instead of just 3.7. We would rather just have 3.7. So we're going to go in and add another processor, one that I wrote called version splitter, that just splits that apart and gives us the last part of it, which is 3.7. And then it passes that through to JSS importer, where it's going to be more useful to us. So you can see there's Cinesync 3.7 right there. And so we're going to go back to the JSS recipe. And we're going to add in the processor called version splitter. There it is. Version splitter. And we're going to change the index to 1. 0 is the first word, essentially, in the version. 1 is the second word. And you can split by space, you can split by dash. It's a cool processor, check it out. And we're going to run it again, and this time we should get version 3.7, which is much more useful for us in the JSS world. Now this is an example of one tweak that you'd have to make. There are potentially all kinds of other different tweaks that you might have to do, including the path of the application might be wrong, or the, I don't know, code signature verification might not be included in the parent recipe. Maybe you want to put that in your new one. So there's all kinds of things you might want to check. But the end goal is that we just ran a JSS recipe, and now we have a policy and a package in our JSS that proved that it worked. So great. So some use cases for this is you can make a monkey or a deploy studio or an install recipe from an existing download recipe. There are, how many download recipes are there? Like, there's 1,000 plus.
Yeah,
I forget the exact count. It's a lot of download recipes that you can choose from. And if you need a monkey recipe made from any of those, you can use Recipe Robot to do that. You can take an existing package recipe and produce a JSS, FileWave, LandRev recipe. I think, well, Absolute used to be one, but now changed their name to LandRev. And if there's a recipe type that we don't know about yet, Recipe Robot's very extensible, and we can build on that too. And in the future, there might be some new recipe type that you can build using some other recipe type. So it's really just a kind of a cookie cutter way of automating that process and making it really simple so that you only have to do the part that requires a human's touch, basically. It's the part that computers still aren't good at, is this between the ears.
Looking beautiful.
So that's the recap. And now I'm going to let Shea talk a little bit about publishing our recipes, sharing them, kind of some best practices for GitHub etiquette, that kind of thing.
The light's still green back there, so yes. Hang on. So you may ask yourself, should I share my recipes? And I can tell you, without going through the exercise of asking these questions, that the answer is yes. So maybe we could just skip it, but we're not going to. But I think the whole thing that we're talking about here, I don't know how many different open source projects we've referenced already, but this is a community that creates things and shares those things with everyone else for the most part, at least those things that they can share, that they're not required to keep top secret inside their business. So I think if there's any chance that somebody else can use it, it's probably worth sharing. So if you think that at least one other person could benefit from using it, then it's probably worth sharing. The next question is, if it's unique, if there's already a recipe out there that does the thing that you're trying to accomplish, it's kind of a party foul to make another recipe that does the same thing. And specifically, I think where we may have seen a large number of duplication recipes like this is in the management tool space. And hopefully the best practices for creating these recipes is improving so that rather than creating a duplicate recipe for example, Casper, you can improve an existing recipe so that multiple people can use it with an override and not need to maintain their own separate version. Because for every organization that wants to override some part of that to create a duplicate Firefox recipe and then something changes about the Firefox recipe. There's a lot of people spinning their wheels doing extra work when they really don't need to. And finally, the question you should ask yourself is, am I willing to maintain these recipes? And we'll talk a little bit more about what this means in a second. But the next question you might ask is, what do I get out of it? Maybe you're a little more pessimistic than altruistic. Why should you go to the trouble? Well, number one is, if you're a terminal warrior and you're doing an AutoPkg search for recipes, then your recipes are going to show up there where everyone can oogle them and enjoy that they're there. It's always a nice feeling to be like, you know what, I would really like to offer this product to my organization. Hit up AutoPkg search. It already exists. So you add that to AutoPkgr or the recipe list that you use to manage AutoPkg, and you just go home for the rest of the day. Because you just save yourself, what, like 4 hours that you spent hacking together some basic, XML to make it work? Somebody already did it for you. The other advantage is that you develop professionally. So you get peer review and feedback. If your recipe doesn't work and anyone uses it, they're going to let you know. And for the most part, I think that the community that uses these things is super supportive and helpful. And it's not always the open source dream of people just sending you pull requests left and right. There's often people asking you to do things that they're not willing to do themselves or can't do themselves. But that's fine. It gives you a target for what you need to work on and improve in your own code. And having that active GitHub profile is a really big resume builder. I guess Elliot grabbed mine.
I'd hire that guy.
What's that?
I'd hire that guy.
Yeah. I guess you have to have a sense of humor to hire somebody like that. But I think one thing that's interesting to note there is that you can see a sharp decrease in my output around November of last year. That's when I changed jobs, so I'm rebuilding a lot of stuff and not super busy. But the goal isn't to have your contribution chart maxed out, all right? It's important to have other things to do in life. That may come as a shock to some people, but I only work no more than 12 hours a day, and that's it. So you got to draw the line somewhere. You get high fives from your fellow Mac admins.
Sometimes beers.
Sometimes beers. If you're really lucky, you get the Grumpy Greg disapproval face. And while it may be initially hurtful, I think that rising to that level to gain his disapproval means you've really made it. So what kind of cleanup is necessary before I share my recipes? So a lot of this is covered in the wiki for AutoPkg, but it bears repeating. Your recipes need to have a unique identifier. And usually what we do is called a reverse domain identifier, where you're going to have some web page URL followed by your username, then the recipe type, then the app name. All right, so example, com.github.home/6, that's this guy over here, .download, .coconut battery. So here are some bad identifiers. People will tell you up and down that a UUID is a valid recipe identifier. But one of the things that Elliot and I are really big on is that when you have a list of recipes that you say, I support in my organization, I need to be able to share that information. It's documentation that I can give to my supervisors, that I can provide to my help desk, or anyone else that needs to see it. I can convert that into something useful, some kind of automated documentation. Again, this is a thing we're going to cover quite extensively in our monkey talk tomorrow. But this UUID is useless because you have no idea what you're even looking at when you do that. So yeah, it's valid, but it doesn't help us with anything. Likewise, the next one on the list, com.github.home/6, coconut battery download, Safari download is the same thing. That extension is used for in-progress Safari downloads. So if you try and look at that cache folder in your Finder, it thinks it's a partially downloaded, Game of Thrones episode or something. So that's why we flip that around. And finally, if you don't own com.apple, you don't work for Apple, and you're not representing them by writing these recipes, you have no business using that domain name. And likewise, you know, if you don't own whatever domain you're slapping on your identifier, then probably shouldn't use it. I think in general, people are using com.github and their GitHub username. I think that's a pretty good way to do it, unless you really are trying to drum up business for your recipe market.
Yeah, I mean, it's perfectly valid if you work for a school to use edu.yourschoolname, as long as your school owns that domain and those recipes are representative of your school. But yeah, don't use a domain you don't own.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, you're going to be building a set of recipes that you're going to share in the AutoPkg organizational repo. Those should be pretty generic, and the next thing we're talking about is how overridable your recipes are. So you want to make them as overridable as possible. So you may very well have a edu.sheaschool.whatever recipe that's an override that you keep internal on an internal GitLab or Git server. Those don't need to be shared. So you can call whatever you want internally, but chances are you're probably going to have a style guide for that as well. So when we're talking about overrideability with these recipes, there's a number of things that a lot of people are using AutoPkg to feed their management tool. And I don't necessarily agree with whoever wrote the recipe's determination of what category this should be in. I'm super uptight about not having 40, 50, 100 different categories in my managed software center. I've written tools to clean that up and recategorize things that predate me, because I don't want to have all those. It's super confusing to the user. It looks unprofessional, and it's a problem anyway, because the person who wrote the recipe can't determine what your organization is going to want to use for categories. Everybody's got a different way of organizing things, and that's fine. We don't all need to use apples, because I'm guessing a lot of us are not providing, what was your example, games, health and fitness. Yeah. Like a lot of these categories don't even apply, and then productivity covers like every single app in your organization. So if you provide the ability to override this, it gives people the opportunity to use that metadata in their management system in a way that makes it actually useful. So we need to make that an input variable wherever possible. Obviously, if you can get some versioning in there and Recipe Robot's going to do this automatically for you, do so, because even if you don't need it, somebody else might need it down the road, and it's pretty simple to slap that in there. And we kind of talked about this before. I've written another product called EasyWriter that helps do a lot of this stuff, create these overrides. But for example, it's a best practice in general that if you're going to monkey import something from AutoPkg, it should go into the testing catalog. And you would think, yeah, that's what all the recipes do. I pulled down every single recipe repo in the AutoPkg org the other night, wrote a little Python program to go through them all and collect a set of all of them and count them all up.
Of course you did.
Yeah, there's a not insignificant Pygal chart of it. You'll see it tomorrow. There's a not an insignificant number of things that are called testing dash something else that only make sense in the organization of the person who shared that recipe, or a variety of other things. So it's probably best, if you're going to provide a monkey recipe, to know that what mother monkey administrators probably want is that it should be testing, and just leave it alone. If you don't want to use testing in your organization, then you can override it with your override. And one of the things we're going to talk about later in our other presentation, again, we're really trying to get a big group like this tomorrow as well, but is that, show of hands, how many people have an override for every single product that you have in your recipe list and supported your organization? Okay, that's a fair amount. Our argument is that if you're responsible for this and you want it to be good, then you probably need to have an override for every single recipe that you support. And finally, the other thing, well, linting's in here as well. Another point to bring up is, in a lot of cases, yeah, we're in America, and we speak American. But you may want to change the language on this, right? So AutoPkg doesn't do localization, so you may need to override stuff to use some other language. And finally, avoid SourceForge like the plague. There's a number of stories that Elliot has collected here about how they were only in a few products adding some crapware onto downloads and not really say anything about it. They claim now that, oh, we'll never do that again, we're so sorry. Well, too bad, your reputation's blown. I don't think, I think in general, the AutoPkg community is like we don't need you.
There's usually a more canonical source, like the developer's website, or if there's a GitHub repo that they've moved to from SourceForge, we tend to use that instead. If the only source is SourceForge, like I think VLC is still just SourceForge, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe.
Or I'm thinking, no, Grand Perspective
You
is
do
one
need
that's
that
only
to watch
SourceForge.
Game of Thrones that you've torrented. So.
Yeah, it's fine as a last resort.
So here's the link. Super easy to find if you want to share stuff. You can learn all about the community practices really quickly.
Yeah. So, I'll go back to the link there. This is really well documented. The process of publishing your recipes. So we're not going to get into it here, but basically you create a repo, you ask them to fork it, and then they fork it. Give you permission to control your own repo on the AutoPkg organization, and that gets you all the benefits that we outlined before. The other thing to keep in mind too is that all this cleanup that's necessary before you share your recipes, Recipe Robot does most of this automatically. So it's yet another reason to automate this recipe writing process and use Recipe Robot is because it just takes away some of the pain of having to lint things because it uses plist lib, or I guess foundation plist, to output the plist in the first place, so you know they're valid. Linting is still a good idea because you're obviously going to make changes and customize them, but it's not as essential as if you wrote it from scratch by hand. So yeah, most of the stuff is already taken care of thanks to the bot. If you're going to share recipes, there's a couple ways to be Fred Rogers, be a good neighbor. First is to always test your recipes and always continue testing your recipes. This is easier said than done. I don't always test my recipes as often as I want to.
You have 1,000.
I have
plus,
1,050
right?
some recipes, yes. The bullet point at the bottom is relevant. If you have lots of recipes, at least test the download recipe because that's the one that's most likely to fail. If the developer changes the layout of their website, URL text searcher is probably going to fail. If they change their versioning scheme, maybe, I don't know, if they change their code signature verification, there's all kinds of things that could happen. And the download recipe is the one that's going to get the brunt of that. So at least test the download recipe. But there's some other ways. There's a one-liner up there. I guess it's technically 3 lines, but it can be made into a one-liner. And it's good practice to make sure your recipes work. It'll let you catch errors before anybody else opens up a GitHub issue for you. Next is, speaking of GitHub issues, be open to collaboration. People are going to complain about things that are not your problem. They're probably something they did wrong. That's going to happen. But equally, somebody's going to find something that you didn't even realize was wrong, and they're going to point it out to you. Maybe even submit a pull request and fix it for you, which is always wonderful. And then likewise, you should go out and tell people about problems that you notice in their recipes, open pull requests for them, kind of pay it forward. That's what open source is all about.
I just came up with another hackathon project.
What's that?
Use the GitHub API. You can look at prospective employees and see what their time to close issues are, and then you can confront them with it when they show up for their interview.
That's genius.
I would never get hired if that were the case, but fortunately no one's written that yet.
And also, keep in mind that you're not in this alone. There's a whole, obviously everybody in every session is talking about the Mac Admin Slack channel. If you're not already on it, and if you're still holding out, then obviously you've got some reason, but it's really a good resource. The AutoPkg channel specifically is full of people who write lots of recipes and run lots of recipes and can help you as you're learning or as you're refining or auditing all your recipes. Be a good recipe neighbor by committing to good commits. And good commit is subjective. There's lots of different standards bodies that will tell you to write your commits in a certain way. Others will contradict that. I've been doing it wrong for years, and I'm about to switch to a different style that I'm sure somebody will tell me in a couple years that I've been doing it wrong for more years. But just find a style and stick to it. People actually do read those commit messages. They should at least. When they're updating their repos, they're going to look at all the messages that you wrote about the changes that you made, and if they agree with those changes, they're going to apply those repo updates. So be brief, so they can fit on 50 characters ideally is what GitHub says, but also descriptive, like explain what changes you made, the gist of what exactly is different. And then make your commits after each discrete change. Like, don't make 10 different changes to 10 different recipes, and then, unless they're exactly the same change, if you make different changes to different recipes, they need to be different commits too. It's just easier to read. And it becomes documentation for you to read later too if you're trying to figure out what's going wrong.
We were just discussing the other night what a great feature it would be if you're trying to insulate your organization from changes in other people's recipe repos that you use. You want to know about changes that they make. And so we're talking about, I don't know, AutoPkg maybe being the appropriate place for this, but when it does that repo update, it's going to give you all of the commit messages and show you the diffs. And you can ignore them or you can read them, but it collects all that information for you and allows you to audit it.
That would be a cool feature, but no promises. And avoid a few party fouls too if you're going to be on the AutoPkg organization on GitHub. Don't change your recipe identifiers unless you really have to. Fair disclosure, I'm guilty of this. There was a cake brew recipe that I had for a long time, and I capitalized the B on cake brew because I thought that's how it was spelled. A while later, I found out, no, actually, that was my mistake.
You're
so
a bad person.
I lived with it for like a year, and then finally the obsession got the best of me.
The guilt caught up with you?
Yeah, so I changed the identifier. But normally you wouldn't do that unless you are willing to break all the old identifier, all the potentially the child recipes and the overrides that people have made globally will just stop working if you change the identifier. So do be careful with that. And don't push to GitHub before you test your recipes that you've just added or modified. You want to make sure that the stuff up there is working, otherwise you're just going to make more work for yourself and others later. Don't introduce plist syntax errors because potentially that is it could potentially prevent people from running any recipes in any repo if they're doing certain things in AutoPkg we've seen. Yeah, we can skip ahead because we're running out of time. But also make sure that you're secure, file vault, two-factor, good passwords. If you're going to have a recipe repo, you owe it to the people who are subscribing to that repo to keep yourself safe. Troubleshooting. There's just a couple tips. Recipe Robot doesn't always work for everything. Here are some things that have worked for me to try to get around some of the problems we've had. Running it in verbose mode gives you a lot of extra information and can potentially point out what's going wrong. Keep cache is something that people don't often use, but it can be really useful, especially if it's downloading a package. Opening a GitHub issue with us is kind of the last resort, but tell us what the input is you're using, and we'll actually run it and we'll take a look at it and try to fix it. But most of the time, it's something that you can find out more yourself first. And I was going to make the little guy jump. Yeah. So to wrap up, we've covered how to create recipes, how to add URL text searcher, how to build child recipes from existing recipes, woohoo, and recommendations for sharing your recipes and troubleshooting. And we would love to answer some questions now if there are any.
Oh yeah, where's that thing?
Yeah.
Here it comes.
And while that's on its way, thank you all for showing up. This has been a great session.
Whoa!
It's okay. He'll buy you a new Mac.
Is this on? Oh, it is. Okay. Sorry.
That was dramatic.
Is your computer okay? All right.
He's good.
So I've never written an AutoPkg recipe before, but I use them all the time. Where should I start?
Start by reading the wiki. GitHub.com/AutoPkg/wiki it has all the basics, including recipe formatting and writing. And then you can jump right into Recipe Robot. Like find an app you want to write a recipe for, build it with Recipe Robot, open it up, take a look at what it did, and it'll become clear the more of those recipes you see.
Yeah, I think time spent on the wiki is always time well spent. I end up rereading that all the time, and I would just say, find an app that doesn't have a recipe for it. Get AutoPkg, do AutoPkg search, and if it doesn't exist, there's your first project. Get Recipe Robot and try and turn it into a recipe chain.
Yep.
And your life will open up from there. It's like being born.
Thank you.
Funny that you should mention that.
What did he say?
He was trolling Adobe. I understand that we didn't quite have the time for it, but they're potentially making a static downloadable package for their products available today, actually. So any second now, somebody's probably going to grab grab that one, and all those Creative Cloud packages should have AutoPkg recipes for them very soon. If you see Carl around, he's the one responsible for that, so buy him a beer.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Chest bump.